for Nord Anglia Education, which is a big global research project which currently works with 29 of our schools around the world. It focuses on the development of skills, particularly those holistic skills that we call 21st century skills or global skills, and how we link those skills to student thinking in a way that improves student outcomes. So we're in the first year of this research project. We're working together with Boston College, and we're already starting to see some interesting data emerge on how these skills are being implemented in our schools and what that looks like when we do that across the curriculum. So this is a topic really close to my interests, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about today. And what I'd like to share is the thinking that sits behind our approach on global 21st century skills, and the teaching and learning that we think really helps students to get better at them when you apply it in the classroom. So in this session, it's going to be in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about what are global skills, then a process for skill development. And in that part of the webinar, I'm going to talk about some very practical strategies that you can use tomorrow or today, if you wanted to, when you were teaching students. And then I'm going to talk about next steps. And in next steps, that's actually just one thing. That's about you taking away this process and thinking about how you might give it a go yourself with a skill of your choice that you feel is important to work on with the students that you teach. Now, just as a heads up, during this session, we'll be having some interactive elements. I'll be using an app called Mentimeter for that as a way of sharing our thinking. I'm going to start doing that in a couple of slides' time. So be ready with some ideas and insights that you're willing to share. So I'll start by posing a rhetorical question that sits underneath the thinking that we're going to be doing together. So the question is really, what are global skills? And why are they important? We hear a lot about them. They've been in the news all the time. The most recent PISA test was on mathematics, actually, but also on one of these global skills, which was creativity. They're part of the discourse around education that's happening a lot, that somehow there are skills that aren't necessarily focused on within the traditional taught academic curriculum that will support our students in doing better in the future, and whether that's in their future school career or in the world of work. Now, this has been a conversation, and I mean, it's sort of a wider conversation that's been happening since at least, I think, the turn of the millennium. And the way that it's talked about is like this. So we know that the skills that our current students will need to succeed in the workplace are going to change, because the workplace is changing. There are new technologies. There is a more diverse way of working. We are increasingly globalized. Our students will be doing jobs that we have never heard of. And they will also do more jobs in their lives than our parents did. So the idea of a job for life has disappeared. We know that the average person has at least 7 different jobs in their lifetime. We're expecting our students to go out into a world of persistent change. And that process has only been accelerated with the new technologies. And here in the back of my mind is the advent of AI, which is perhaps the most recent technological shift that we're experiencing. And to be able to cope with that, a different set of skills is going to be important. So in 2015, the World Economic Forum did a survey. It was for their Future of Jobs report. And on the left here, you can see the attributes that business organizations identified as the core skills for their workforce in 2015. Now, they did this survey again in 2023. And these were the skills that workforces said were important then. So have a look at these 2 lists for a moment. What do you notice? No, I can't see the chat right now. So if anything's coming up in the chat, Margaret, let me know. But I'm very happy for people just to have a bit of a read, just to do a bit of thinking. Okay, so one of the things that I noticed when I was comparing these lists, and the lists are quite interesting, I think, because they tell you something about our shifting priorities in those intervening 8 years. You can see that creativity has moved up. In 2015. Creativity was number 10. I mean, there were more, but these were the top 10. And now it's number 2. Creativity is something that's going to be very much more important for our students when they go out into the world. You can see that quality control is something that's moved down from 6 to 10. What you can also notice is that as the pace of technological development has increased, it's the skills that make us most human that have become the most important. So aspects such as motivation and self-awareness, empathy and active listening, flexibility of thought and an agile, resilient response to uncertainty and change are the skills that we think our students are going to need most when they're going out into potentially a more uncertain future. But the most interesting thing is how few of the items on the list are recognizable as the subjects we are taught in school. So we know that our students need global skills for the future. And how can we prepare them for the skills they need? To be successful in an increasingly complex and difficult world, they're going to need more than the core academic subjects. Indeed, the things that matter in the world outside of school aren't usually the things you can test with single answers to simple questions. Excuse me. Solutions to climate change, to international conflict, to economic turbulence, to, in fact, most of the things that we know that our students might struggle with they're not simple, they're often conflicting, and they require the careful consideration of empathic, creative, critical thinkers. So in other words, effective schooling teaches students how to ask questions, how to navigate uncertainty, how to collaborate, how to explore. And we do a lot of this already. And I know in the work that you do with students, you'll be looking at how they ask questions, you'll be working with them on how to collaborate with others and people who are different to them, which is something that we think carefully about in international schooling as well. And your schools that you're working will have mottos and values that speak to the importance of these different skills and attributes. So sometimes you see these words around the building. So I know when I was at school, the important words were things like inspire and excellence. And I knew they were important because they were written on the stairs. As you went up the stairs, you could see them in between the steps. So while these skills and values have always been important in thriving school cultures, it can be very difficult to demonstrate their development. We don't talk about progress in being committed. We don't talk about what it means to excel in curiosity. And our students don't know if they're getting better at these things. You might already work on integrating some of these skills within your curriculum. So organizations like the IB, if you work in an IB school, or some of the exam frameworks you might use or curriculum frameworks that you might use might put these skills front and center. And I've put the IB up because it's something that's very much front and center in the international curriculum that we work on in North Anglia and some of our other North Anglia schools around the world. These are just sort of one example of a set in skills and values. The tricky thing is, and the part that I want to focus on in this webinar, is how do we teach these things in a way that is specific, just like the way that we teach fractions or the way that we teach grammatical constructs or the way that we teach the scientific method. How do we teach being open-minded? And if we know we want students to get better at these things, if we want them to be more open-minded, better inquirers, if we want them to be more balanced in their approach to their work and to their life, then how can we assess this? How can we measure progress in these things? How can we think about this in a way that is specific so that we know that students improve over time? And the key to this is having very specific teaching approaches that we can see that students are getting better at applying. So, before we go any further, I want to ask you, which skills, attributes, or values does your school, by which I mean the school that you work in, or if not the school that you work in, a school that you have recently been in, or even your own school, if you want to think back to when you were at school, which skills, attributes, or values does your school teach and celebrate? So I know that the school I work at in Hong Kong has integrity and courage, as well as a few others. I think there are 6 that they think are really important for their school community. So I just want you to say 3. Now you'll see on the screen, actually, let's go here first. Here, there's a QR code. So if you could scan that using your phone, or you can go to menti.com and type in 2350-4906 to get into the Mentimeter. And we're going to create a word cloud because I'm interested to take a snapshot from the room today to think about, comparing it back in my head to that list from the World Economic Forum. What are the skills that our schools are currently embedding in their school community? Okay, we've had 3 responses in so far. Thank you. So I think you can enter 3 at a time. I'm going to add some as well. If anybody's having trouble getting into the chat, just let me know. Sorry, into the Mentimeter, what I meant there. Okay, so I just give everybody just a couple more moments to put any answers in, or just to use this as a moment for quiet reflection, just thinking about the skills that are important in the school that you work in. One moment. So thank you to the people who are adding. We've got truth, justice, and perseverance in the chat. We've got striving for excellence and critical thinking up on the word cloud, integrity, kindness, courage, problem solving, creativity, and practice makes perfect, which I love, which is an interesting one and actually makes me wonder, looking at it, if when we think about global skills, we always think about one word, right? They tend to come through as a one-word thing, but actually having phrases perhaps communicates a slightly more complex concept sometimes, and things that are worth thinking about. Thank you for those. Okay, if we move back across, I'd like to talk now about something very practical, which is a process for skill development. And it sounds simple, and it's intended to be, because the thing about developing these kinds of skills is it's complicated. And it's complicated because there aren't the same kinds of written curricula, there aren't the same ways of doing that have been as embedded in schools as we have, for example, the teaching of maths. If I was teaching maths, then I was teaching multiplication, we'd have the column method, we'd have a way that we knew was the way of getting better at these things. Whereas when we think about these skills that are more abstract at the moment, we have less clarity on what it is we actually do to make these better, not just for one individual student, which feels simple, relatively simple, but in a class or across a community in an entire school. So the 3 steps I'd like to talk about today are: 1, establishing a shared understanding. The second is linking the skill to the thinking. That's my favorite step. I'm looking forward to talking about that. And the third one is creating intentional opportunities to practice. So I'm going to come back to this process as we go through, thinking about each of the steps in turn. And then this is the bit that I'd like you to take away afterwards. So let's talk about what it means to establish a shared culture of understanding. By this, I mean, do we know what these skills are? Have we agreed on the same skills that we think are important? And once we have, do I, as a teacher, have the same understanding of what this skill means as you do? So, for example, if we were taking the skill of compassion, which is something I'm going to talk about in a minute, because I think it's a really important one. What do I mean by compassion? And if I walked outside my classroom and I grabbed the next teacher who came down the corridor and asked them what compassion meant, would they say the same thing? Do we mean the same thing by creativity? Do we mean the same thing by critical thinking? When we're talking about practice makes perfect, what are we practicing? And what do we mean by it getting better? And also, do my students understand it the way that I do? When I say this word, do they know what it means? Have we got a definition that we share? Do we talk about these skills in our teaching and learning? And are they something that we teach students how to get better at? And interestingly, do our students know what they're good at and which skills and attributes they find harder to master? And this is interesting because this is part of something I've been working on within the project that's called metacognitive awareness. So it's a student having a sense of who they are, and their areas of strength and their areas of challenge. Now, students often know this because teachers have told them. So I might know that I wasn't particularly strong at maths or art, but I was stronger at English and drama, for example, because I'd had marks back, I knew. But we're not always as self-aware with global skills. Do you know how, for example, do you know how compassionate you are? Do you know how curious you are? I have no sense of it. I can't put myself on a bell curve. I have no benchmarks. I'm not necessarily aware in the general scheme of things how good I am at these things. So let's start with compassionate, and let's do this process together. So over the next few slides, we're going to do this shared process together. I'm going to ask you first, we're going to develop a shared understanding of the skill I'm going to talk about, which is compassion, because I think it's really important to have compassion in the kind of world that we're growing into. So what does the word compassionate mean to you? And let's gather our answers together before we start thinking about how we teach it. So I've got the Menti up again here. I just need to move on to the next slide here. So this is a short answer, and you can put it here, or if you prefer, you can pop it in the chat. This one's just nice because it shows everybody's up on the screen. So if you could put the answer to the question, what does the word compassionate mean to you? And it can be a couple of words, it can be a sentence, it's your call. I just give you a few minutes to think about it and then put your answer down. Thank you for that first response. I love it. So be kind to every kind of creatures in our world. Please keep adding. Thank you for those next two answers. So I'm just going to call these out: showing kindness to others, being respectful, being aware of how you treat others, which is in the other comment there, helping others and treating others with respect, showing empathy towards other people. Thank you. And this is actually, if you're choosing to focus on a skill, or you have a particular skill as one of your school values, you might have done this kind of task already with your class, but trying to define exactly what people think it is a really excellent starting point. Being able to understand how people feel and think. Yes. And getting this shared definition and allowing some time for reflection. And I know I'm being quite slow here, right? And I'm trying to leave some time in the webinar for it on purpose, because I want it to be quite a slow, reflective process. Because this is the first step in making it a thinking process. By trying to, sometimes, and when I started thinking about compassion, I realized I didn't really know what it meant to be kind or be compassionate, if they are the same thing, in terms of how we think that way. And that's the bit that's going to matter, because as educators, we're in the business of thinking and creating space and time and opportunity to develop student thinking. Okay, I'm going to move us on. If you have got an answer that you haven't managed to put up yet, you're very welcome to put it in the chat in a minute if you wanted more thinking time. But I'm going to take these 5 answers as our starting point for moving on to the next step in our process. So we've started by building a shared understanding, which is step 1. The part I'd like to think about now is, once we have a shared understanding of what it is, we need to think about how we demonstrate it. So we can talk about how to be compassionate, and we do. Yeah, anybody who's been in a classroom with younger children talks a lot about being kind, having kind hands, being nice to others. I still talk about this a lot. But what's important to talk about is having a fully developed understanding of what that skill or value is, and crucially why it's hard. If we all know it's good to be kind, it's good to be compassionate, why aren't we sometimes? Because sometimes we're not. We know we're not. So what are the barriers towards us acting this way? We know it's pretty much a universal good. We want to be kind to others. We can all say that, but sometimes we are not kind to others. We do not act in a compassionate way. What is it that's acting against that? What is it that we have to work on to make that more possible more of the time? So for a student to act in a more compassionate way, first, they have to think in a more compassionate way. So what are the cognitive processes that make somebody more compassionate, more caring, more kind? How are we thinking to make that more possible? Now, once you start getting under the skin of this, it helps to understand what some of the different kinds of thinking are. So I've turned to Harvard here, who think about this a lot. Harvard have a project that works on global competencies and the kind of thinking that underpins global competencies. And if you're interested to look afterwards, when we have some time for Q&A at the end, I can share a link to that in the chat. There's a publication on it that I find super interesting. But for the moment, I'm going to start with the Harvard Understanding Map. HPZ stands for Harvard Project Zero, which is the research team who've been working on this area for the last decades, I think about 30 years. So there are 8 different ways of understanding. So cognitive processes. One is reasoning with evidence, asking students why they think so. Then we've got, I'm going clockwise, making connections. So how does this fit with what you already know? Uncovering complexity, which is about going beneath the surface. Capturing the heart. So by that, I mean not making someone love you, but trying to identify what the core or center of something is and forming conclusions about it. Then at the bottom, we've got building explanations about what's really going on, describing what's there. So that's an observational one, what we see and notice. Wondering, which is curiosity. And finally, considering different viewpoints. So what's another angle on this? So if these are the types of understanding that underpin learning, and what Harvard is saying is that most of the thinking that we do has one of these ways of thinking, one of these ways of understanding as its base. If we look at this, which of these types of thinking would best help us to develop compassion? Now, potentially, there isn't just one. There is no right answer here. And it would also depend on the kind of learning that you're doing. You might want to go beneath the surface of an issue to understand it more deeply. Or you might want to build some explanations about what's really happening to start to get to a better understanding of who the other person is or what they're going through. For the moment, I'm going to look at the area of considering different viewpoints, because one of the aspects that I think underpins compassion is being able to see other perspectives. So being able to see other people's points of view, I think, is really important to developing a more compassionate way of thinking. So I'm going to talk about how I would structure that in a classroom. Once you've identified the kind of thinking that you want students to do, you can provide them with a strategy that is going to help them thinking that way. And by strategy, I mean a series of prompt questions or a structured series of steps that makes them think in that way or encourages them to think in that way. So I've got 2 examples here. I've got one for younger students and I've got one for older students. The one for younger students is one of my favorites. Okay, these are understanding glasses. And when students put them on, they become a perspective detective. Now, if you want, they can actually make these glasses and put them on as a pair of like paper sunglasses in class. I know some teachers have bought some of the really fun ones, which are like bright pink or have glitter on, and they have them that students can use as a tangible clue, something they can reach to when they know they want to think in that way. Or you could just say it and have it as an icon on screen. It depends how physical you wanted to make it. So students can make their understanding glasses and they put it on to observe other people's emotions and understand how they might be feeling. Now, once you get to the older students, they might not want to be perspective detectives anymore. They might not want to put on or make their understanding glasses. So another way of doing this is to ask students to think in 3 steps and go outwards each time. So they think about myself, they think about my community, so they think about others, and then they think about the world. So then think about the very wide perspectives that you could have on an issue. And the reason why, the reason why that three-part strategy is good, I'm not sure why that moved on, but I can't move it back now. The reason why that three-part strategy is good is because it's also those three layers of thinking are the same three layers of thinking that underpin the global perspectives IGCSE framework that for international schools is the way that students are assessed on their ability to see outwards. So let's go to an example of how we might do this. So this is a scenario, a task that we use with year 3 or year 4. So we show the students a scenario and you get them to put on their understanding glasses and then you have a discussion. So the idea is that these strategies are used in social learning, they're discussion based. And so students start to verbalize their thinking and hear their thinking of others. So we've got our understanding glasses on. And what we're going to talk about is your best friend is moving away and is feeling anxious. How could you show support? And what I want is now for us as a class to start thinking how my friend might be feeling, what might she be worried about, and therefore what are the things that she might need. And for some students, this level of structure is really, really helpful. If you've got a student that isn't used to anticipating or accommodating the needs of others, then they're going to need concrete opportunities to practice this. And even if you have got students that regularly are expected to accommodate the needs of others in their life, they still might struggle because they might not always know how. So providing opportunities like this to practice and to show that you as a teacher think this is important is a great way to demonstrate this skill. The second one is one we're going to do together. Okay, so now you are my class, we're middle schoolers, and we're going to look at this image on screen. And I want to think deeply about this issue from a way that shows compassion, because that's the skill we're going to be working on today. It's hard to care about something if you're not using thinking processes that show compassion. It's hard to feel it's relevant. So we're going to go through 3 steps. Why is this important to me? Why is this important to my community? And why is it important for the world? So you can see the issue on screen here. We've got the issue here of plastic, and we've got pollution, and we've got all of the things that we're seeing routinely on our beaches and our environment. So we're going to take these 3 prompts, and I'd like you to jot down your thinking and put it on the Menti now under these 3 prompt questions. If you want, you can unmute and talk about it, and that would be perfect, because usually this would be a discussion-based exercise in class. Or if you'd rather just think about it quietly, obviously, that's fine too. So let's go across for a moment. Oops. Just need to kind of get, for some reason, the swipe here isn't working as well as it did. Let me go backwards and try, there we are. Move across. Right, so 3 prompts, and if you go into your Menti, it should have moved on. So why is this important to me? Why is this important for my community? And why is it important for the world? So why is this an important issue that we should care about? And if you could put 3 bullet points in your response or in the chat or in your thinking. So I've got a couple of answers on screen here now. When we think me, we can see that. So me is interesting because it's actually that kind of self-centered view that we see in the development of teenagers. Actually, teenagers are interesting because at a certain point they stop being empathic, and it's part of their natural development into adulthood. And you might have experienced this directly or remember going through this yourself. There's a point at which empathy pauses because the way that teenagers become self-conscious and the perception of their peer group of who they are becomes more important than wider concerns. So generating empathy in young people becomes a really important intentional skill, because in a way they're relearning it. They're relearning what it means to be empathic as adults. So these initial me statements are good because we're starting from a place that doesn't feel empathic. So me stops me going to the beach. This is an issue because it dirties my living environment, so I get sick. But then we move out to the next step, which is my community. So it isn't safe for children, someone other than me, or it pollutes my living environment, so lots of living things may get killed. For the world, it's a problem for wildlife. And also, more importantly, as we're living on Earth, I'll have no place to go. Now, I'm conscious of time. If I was doing this with the class, I'd spend ages on it, right? We'd talk deeply about these 3 different levels of perspective and think about how we could apply them to what we were learning in that particular topic. And this isn't something you'd necessarily spend a special lesson on, because one of the things we know is that we never have any time. So you would be teaching another curriculum area. For example, that an issue of environmental pollution might come into something I was teaching in geography. I could also think about how I was going to integrate. So this strategy is actually called the 3 whys: myself, my community, the world. Why does it matter to myself, for example? So I could use my understanding glasses, or I could use the 3 whys strategy in lots of different curriculum areas when I was already doing this in my planning. I could use it in history if I wanted to explore a historical event from different perspectives. I could use it in English if we were looking at a particular topic or area or theme in the books that we were reading. And I could also use it in, I'm going back, mathematics. And it's interesting, compassion and mathematics is an interesting combination. How do we think about mathematics compassionately? Because this is the subject area that often tells me that it doesn't fit. But you could, because when you think about statistics, what statistics raise are issues. So you could think about what statistics mean. A certain percentage of people don't have access to clean water, for example. But what does that mean? What does that mean underneath that statistic for me, myself, and the world? How might that affect others when I put my understanding glasses on? And it's important to think about subject integration as well. Because when you look at a student's day, their day looks like this. They go from subject to subject to subject to subject. This is actually my son's timetable. He's in year 8, and this is his regular school day. Now, all of these different subject areas have a different way of thinking about these skills. If he is in school on a Monday and his second lesson is music, their definition of creativity would be very different to what creativity looks like in English, which would be very different to what creativity looks like in science. So if we have a value that we think is important for our whole school community, do we know as we go to subject what that means in that particular subject area? If I'm a teacher of these subject areas, if I'm a primary teacher and I'm teaching all these subject areas, how does each one of these develop that particular skill? So just like we saw, how can my studies of geography develop my compassion? How can I still be compassionate when I'm working with numbers? How can reading in literature help me to develop my empathy? This is important not just because it gives us consistency, but it's important from a point of view of student thinking as well. So a key aspect of learning is the idea of transfer. We know something well, we've internalized it, we've learned it, when we can transfer it from one situation to another. And it's an aspect of metacognition. So This aspect of transfer is something that we want our students to be able to achieve, because it also shows that they've become independent learners who have ownership over this particular skill. In the English National Curriculum, it's called mastery, which I quite like as a phrase, the idea that I have mastered something. Now, there are two kinds of transfer. The first is near transfer. So we're going from the left of the screen to the middle. Near transfer is something our students experience a lot. So if you're teaching a topic and then you test it in an end of unit test with different questions, that's near transfer. I'm transferring what I've learned to a test environment. If I'm transferring something from one subject area to another, if I've learned how to write an essay in English and I'm being asked to write an essay in history and I use the same skills, I'm transferring that from one subject to the next. Far transfer is harder, and it's something our students do less. So far transfer is when you take a skill you've developed in school and then you're put in a situation and nobody tells you what the rules are. So it's not like you're being told this is a multiplication problem and you're going to use your column method. It's you being told you need to solve this problem and you need to use whatever's available to try and find a solution. We can support our students in doing this when we give them real-world problems in class, when we give them case studies and scenarios, or they work on big interdisciplinary projects where they have to work out the strategy for themselves. So transfer is what we're aiming at, because if we think back to the start of this webinar, we want our students to have the skills and the strategies to use those skills to be able to go out into the world and be successful, no matter what complex, changing environment they're put into. So we need to give them the independence and opportunities to practice independence to put those strategies into place. So there's 3 steps: establishing a shared understanding, linking the skill to the thinking, and working out what the thinking is that underpins that skill, developing a strategy to help students apply it or finding a strategy, and then in lessons, in your teaching, giving them structured opportunities to practice. And if these opportunities to practice can be social, discussion-based, where they share their thinking and hear the thinking of others, then that's even better. Okay, so I want you to think now about the skill that you'd like to develop with your students. And if you want to, you can share it in the chat, or you can just have it in mind. My favorite is compassion, I've shown you today, but it might be that you want to take one of the values that you have in your school and think about how you would actively teach that, or work ideally with other teachers to actively teach it. I'll give you some time to think about that. And in the meantime, we've got some time, the next 10 minutes or so, if you've got any questions.